The decree had already been read aloud by the time June reached the great hall. She knew it before she pushed open the heavy oak doors, before the cold draft from the mountain corridor swept past her, before she saw the circle of faces turning toward her with that particular mixture of pity and relief that it was her and not them. She knew it because the words had been carried on whispers through stone hallways all morning, passing from mouth to mouth like smoke, finding its way through every crack and gap in the walls. Barren, cursed, cast out. The great hall of Stonecrest Keep smelled of pine resin and old ash. The fire in the central hearth had burned low, casting uneven orange light across the flagstone floor and the faces of the pack council seated behind the long elm table. Elder Brom sat at the center, his white beard catching the firelight, his expression carved from something harder than stone. To his left sat Counselor Mira, whose fingers moved ceaselessly over the carved bone beads at her wrist. To his right, the seat that mattered most stood empty. June walked the length of that hall alone. Her boots were worn thin at the soles, and she could feel the cold of the stone through the leather with every step. Her gray wool cloak, the one her mother had stitched before she died, was too light for the season. Outside, the first hard frost of autumn had arrived overnight, silvering the grass and glazing the narrow windows with ice. Inside, the hall felt almost as cold. She stopped 3 feet from the table, as the custom demanded. She did not lower her head. Elder Brom unrolled the parchment before him with ceremonial slowness, though everyone present already knew what it said. June, daughter of Wren, Omega of the Stonecrest Pack. His voice was flat and rehearsed. It has been determined by the council, following the examination conducted by our healers, that you are unable to fulfill the fundamental obligation required of all bonded members of this pack. He paused, letting the silence do the work his words could not quite finish. You are hereby released from pack protection. Your quarters will be vacated within 3 days. Your name will be removed from the ancestral record. Someone coughed near the back of the room. A log shifted in the hearth and sent up a small shower of sparks. June did not move. She had rehearsed stillness for months, since the first healer shook her head. Since the second healer said the word barren so gently it felt like a blade wrapped in cloth. Since the whispers had begun, and the doors had begun to close a half-second earlier when she walked down corridors, and the spaces beside her at the communal table had begun to fill with careful absences. She had made herself practice not flinching, because she understood, with the cold clarity that comes from having nothing left to protect, that if she flinched now, they would take that too. Is there anything you wish to say? Counselor Mira asked. Her voice carried something that might have been sympathy, or might have been the performance of it. No, June said. The walk back out was longer than the walk in had been. She felt each face like a small stone pressed against her skin. Some she had known her whole life. Petra, who had braided her hair for the harvest festival when they were girls. Old Gareth, who had taught her to read maps in the library corner. They watched her go, and she did not look back, because looking back would have cost her the last thing she still owned, her composure. She had 3 days. She used 2 of them to pack what little she had into a canvas traveling bag. 2 changes of clothes, her mother's small iron needle case, a pair of good gloves, a half loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, and the 12 copper coins she had saved over 4 years of work in the keep storage rooms. She had done an honest accounting. 12 coppers would buy her 3 nights at a roadside inn if she was careful, or 1 night in passage on a trade cart heading south toward the valley towns. On the 3rd morning, she left before dawn. The frost had deepened overnight. The world outside Stonecrest's walls was blue-gray and silent, the pines standing stiff and dark against a sky that hadn't yet decided whether to offer light. June's breath came out in white clouds. She adjusted the strap of her bag against her shoulder, pulled her mother's cloak tighter, and began walking south along the mountain road. She had no destination beyond a way. She told herself this was not grief. It was simply movement. 1 foot, then the other, on the frozen dirt of the road. The cold bit at her fingers inside her gloves. The bag was heavier than it looked, though it contained almost nothing. She thought about this, how absence could still have weight. By mid-morning, she had passed the 2 carved pine markers that signaled the edge of Stonecrest territory, and she felt the symbolic crossing like a door closing behind her. She was in open land now, belonging to no pack, protected by no one. The road curved downhill between stands of spruce and bare-branched rowan. The mountain dropped away gradually, and through gaps in the tree line she could see the gray valley below, threaded with a river she didn't know the name of. The sky had settled into a flat pewter overcast. Snow, she thought. Snow was coming before nightfall. She heard the horses before she saw them. The sound came from the road ahead, from around a sharp bend where the hillside cut close. The rhythmic double beat of heavy hooves on hard ground, the jingle of metal fittings, the particular low snort of large animals being held to a controlled pace. More than one. More than 2. June stepped to the side of the road and waited. They came around the bend in a formation that made her stomach tighten without fully understanding why. 4 horses, large and dark-coated, carrying riders in black riding cloaks. Between them, almost obscured at first, was a figure on a horse larger than the others. A deep charcoal gray stallion, moving with the kind of controlled precision that spoke of careful breeding and careful hands. The rider sat very straight. He wore no insignia that June could immediately identify. But everything about the way the others oriented toward him, small shifts of attention, the angle of their bodies, told her exactly what he was before she saw his face. He saw her at the same moment she recognized the shape of his authority. The group slowed. The rider on the gray stallion lifted one hand, a brief and economical gesture, and the 4 flanking riders fell back 3 paces. He guided his horse to the edge of the road and looked down at her. He was perhaps 30, with a face that weather and responsibility had made angular. A strong jaw darkened with several days of beard, eyes the color of winter bark, dark and difficult to read. A scar ran faint and old along his left cheekbone. His riding cloak was good wool, deep black, with a simple silver clasp at the throat. He looked like a man who had learned very young that stillness conveyed more power than motion. "You're walking south," he said. Not a question. "I am," June said. His eyes moved over her, not the way some men looked at women, but the way a person reads a map they have seen before and recognize something unexpected. His gaze settled briefly on the Stonecrest mark still stitched into the collar of her cloak, the small gray wolf symbol that identified her origin, and something shifted in his expression. A narrowing. A calculation. "Stonecrest cast someone out in the first frost," he said. "That's unusual." June said nothing. "Where are you going?" "South," she said. A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, not quite anything she could name. He reached into the saddlebag at his right knee and withdrew something wrapped in brown cloth, then leaned down from the saddle and held it toward her. His arm was steady, unhurried, as if offering food to a stranger on a mountain road in freezing weather was an ordinary part of his morning. She didn't take it immediately. "It's bread," he said. "Walnut and dried apple. My cook overpacks." She looked at the package, then at his face, then at the 4 riders behind him who were very carefully looking at the trees. She took the bread. "Thank you," she said, because her mother had raised her to say it. He straightened in the saddle and gathered his reins. He was about to turn the horse. She could see it in the shift of his weight. Then he stopped. "The valley road forks at the bottom of the hill," he said, not looking at her now. "Left goes to Durnwall, right goes to the Ashford Crossroads, where there are 3 inns and a healer's hall that doesn't ask for pack papers." A pause. "The right fork is safer for someone traveling alone." He clicked his tongue softly, and the gray stallion moved forward, and the 4 riders followed, and within 30 seconds, the sound of hooves had rounded the next bend and disappeared. June stood alone on the frozen road, holding a package of bread, with the smell of horse and wood smoke and something colder than either fading slowly on the air around her. She looked down at the bread, then up at the empty road. Then she thought, who was that man? And why did he know which road is safer for someone with no pack papers? She took the right fork. The snow arrived before she reached the valley. It came quietly, the way the worst things often do. Without announcement, without drama. Just a shift in the air, and then the first pale flakes drifting sideways through the spruce branches, catching on June's eyelashes and melting against the back of her neck, where her cloak didn't quite cover. Within an hour, the road had gone white and soft underfoot, muffling her footsteps, erasing the tracks she'd made and the ones before her, making the world feel sealed and separate from everything it had been. She ate the bread as she walked. It was good bread, dense and slightly sweet, with the walnut pieces giving it weight. She ate half and wrapped the rest carefully, because 12 copper coins and half a loaf of bread were her entire material existence. And she had learned, in the slow, grinding way that most important lessons arrive, not to consume what she might need tomorrow for the comfort of today. The right fork, as the stranger had said, led to the Ashford crossroads. She smelled it before she saw it. Wood smoke layered over the sharper scent of livestock, hay, and something frying in animal fat that made her stomach respond with embarrassing urgency. The crossroads itself was a modest cluster of buildings around a wide, muddy square, already dusted with snow. 2 inns, a farrier's stable with the doors thrown open and orange lamplights spilling out, a covered market stall being hastily packed up by a man in a leather apron, and at the far edge, a low stone building with a green cedar bough hung above the door, the healer's hall marker. June went to the cheaper of the 2 inns first. The common room was warm and low-ceilinged, smelling of tallow candles and damp wool, and the particular human density of people who had come in from the cold. A fire burned large in the stone hearth along the far wall. 3 men at a table near the window were deep in a card game, their voices low. A woman behind the bar counter was wiping down a wooden surface with practiced efficiency, her gray hair pinned back, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Room?" June asked. The woman behind the counter looked her over. Her gaze moved to the Stonecrest collar mark, then to the worn boots, then to the single bag. The assessment took perhaps 4 seconds. 2 copper a night. Meal included at the common table, morning and evening. She set the rag down. "No pack papers required. We don't ask." June counted out 4 copper coins. 2 nights, because she needed time to think, and the snow outside was making decisions for her. She slid them across the counter. The room was small and cold, but dry, with a narrow bed, a washstand with a ceramic pitcher, and a single window overlooking the crossroads square. June set her bag on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed, and let herself feel the ache in her feet and calves that she'd been refusing to acknowledge for the last 3 hours of walking. She sat there for a long moment in the gray afternoon light, watching snow fall past the window. Then she made herself stand up, wash her face with the cold water from the pitcher, and go back downstairs to the common table, because sitting alone with her thoughts in a cold room was a luxury she could not afford to indulge. The healer's hall the next morning was clean and spare, smelling of dried herbs, yarrow, comfrey, something sharper she didn't recognize, and the particular mineral scent of stone that has been kept very cold and then slowly warmed. The healer was a woman named Ozra, perhaps 50, with close-cropped gray hair and hands that moved with the economy of long practice. June had not intended to visit the healer. She had gone there meaning to ask about work. The innkeeper had mentioned they sometimes needed help. But Ozra had one look at her and said quietly, "You've been walking on something that needs attention," and nodded at June's right hand, where a blister had broken on the walk down and was showing pink and raw at the edge of her glove. It was such a small thing. It was such an ordinary, practical thing. And yet when Ozra cleaned it and wrapped it with practiced gentleness, June had to concentrate very hard on the stone wall behind the healer's head and breathe through her nose. "You came from the mountain," Ozra said, not looking up from her work. Yes. Stonecrest. June glanced at her collar again. She was going to have to remove that mark. Yes. Ozra tied the small bandage and sat back. She studied June's face with the same direct, evaluating steadiness she'd probably used on 1,000 patients. And they told you the healers there were certain about their diagnosis. June went very still. I've been a healer for 26 years, Ozra said, without particular drama, reaching for a jar of salve on the shelf behind her. I've seen 3 women in this hall in the last decade who were told the same thing by mountain pack healers. 2 of them had children afterward. She set the jar on the table between them. Mountain diagnostics are 20 years behind the valley methods. What they call barren, we sometimes call something else entirely. The room felt very quiet. What do you call it? June asked. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. An imbalance. Sometimes stress. Sometimes illness that passed but left a shadow. Ozra folded her hands on the table. Sometimes nothing at all. Just a healer who didn't look carefully enough. She paused. I'm not making you a promise, but if you wanted to be examined properly, I could do that, at no cost. I don't charge women who've been turned out with nothing. June looked at the jar of salve, at the dried bundles hanging from the ceiling beams, at the window, where the snow had stopped, and thin winter light was cutting through the clouds for the first time in 2 days. She thought about the word barren, and how it had been applied to her like a seal on a document, permanent and official, closing doors she hadn't even known she'd wanted to walk through. All right, she said. She was still sitting in the healer's hall 2 hours later, staring at the wall, when the door opened behind her and a woman walked in who filled the frame with a kind of physical authority that had nothing to do with size. She was not particularly tall, but she moved like someone who had decided, a long time ago, that rooms belonged to her until proven otherwise. She was perhaps 40, with sharp dark eyes, black hair cut bluntly at her jaw, and a long charcoal riding coat that had seen serious weather. A long knife hung at her hip in a worn leather sheath. She stopped when she saw June. Her eyes moved over June with the same quick calculation June had seen the day before, on the road, from the back of a gray stallion. You took the right fork, the woman said. June blinked. I'm sorry. He mentioned a woman walking south from Stonecrest. Said she had sense enough to listen to directions. The woman crossed the room and dropped into the chair across from June with the easy familiarity of someone who owned it. I'm Riva. I ride with Leander's company. Leander. The name landed with a weight that suggested June was supposed to recognize it. She didn't, quite. But she felt the outline of it, the way you feel the shape of something large in dark water. The man on the gray horse, June said. The Alpha King, Riva said, watching June's face carefully. Of the Northern Territories. A pause. You didn't know? No. Riva studied her for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted. The sharpness didn't leave, but something else came in alongside it. Something that might have been interest. He sent me to find you, she said. Why? Because he wants to offer you something. Riva leaned forward, elbows on the table, her dark eyes direct and entirely unreadable. Stonecrest Keep is in his territory. What they did to you, casting out an Omega in the first frost with no hearing, no appeal, that's a violation of Northern law. He wants to know if you'll come forward as a witness. She paused. And he's offering you sanctuary at the King's Hall while the matter is investigated. Room, meals, work if you want it. No obligation beyond your testimony. June looked at her hands, the bandaged one, and the unbandaged one, and the 12 copper coins. She'd counted them again that morning, habit by now, sitting in her pocket. She thought about Ozra's words. Sometimes nothing at all. Just a healer who didn't look carefully enough. She thought about the man on the gray horse, who had handed her bread from a saddlebag without making it a performance of charity, and who had known which road was safer for a woman with no pack papers. She thought, this could be a trap. She also thought, I have 2 nights paid and 8 copper coins and nowhere to be. What kind of work? She asked. Riva's mouth curved, brief and not unkind. What kind can you do? Storage accounting, supply records. I managed Stonecrest's winter inventory for 4 years. Then you'll fit right in, Riva said, and stood, and held out her hand. We leave at first light. The King's Hall is 2 days' ride north. June looked at the outstretched hand. Then she thought of something. North, she said. That's back toward the mountain. Yes, Riva said, toward Stonecrest. Yes. Riva's eyes were steady. Is that a problem? June thought of Elder Brom reading from his parchment with his carved stone expression. She thought of the doors closing a half-second early. She thought of the word barren and the way it had been spoken. So gently, like a blade wrapped in cloth. No, she said, and took Riva's hand. It's not a problem. She slept better that night than she had in months. The King's Hall was not what June had imagined. She had built a picture of it during the 2-day ride north, something fortress-like and forbidding, all sharp angles and cold stone, the kind of place designed to remind visitors of the distance between themselves and the person who lived there. She had prepared herself for grandeur deployed as intimidation, for corridors meant to make you feel small. What she found instead was a working keep. It sat on a wide shelf of land where the mountain plateau opened out, surrounded by pine forest on 3 sides, and a long stone wall on the 4th that faced the valley road. The wall was old and well-maintained, its gate standing open in the mid-morning with steady traffic passing through. Supply carts loaded with winter root vegetables and salted meat, riders coming and going, a group of 3 men carrying long timber planks toward a building on the eastern side that was clearly mid-construction. A dog of indeterminate large breed was sleeping directly in the center of the main path, and nobody was making it move. Inside the wall, the keep itself was broad and 3-storied, built of the same dark granite as the mountain it backed against. But the windows were large and the doors were open, and there were herb beds along the southern wall, brown and frost-struck now, but clearly tended. And somewhere inside something was being baked with cinnamon, and the smell of it drifted out into the cold air and landed on June like a hand on her shoulder. Riva led her horse through the gates without slowing. Try not to look impressed, she said without looking at June. It encourages the stable boys. June adjusted her expression and said nothing. She was given a room on the 2nd floor, small but real, with a proper hearth that the housekeeper, a round-faced woman named Dora, lit for her within minutes of her arrival. The bed had 2 wool blankets and a fur throw at the foot. The window looked out over the herb garden and the pine tree line beyond the wall, and the afternoon light came through it at an angle that turned the stone walls briefly amber. Meals in the main hall at dawn, midday, and dusk, Dada told her, tucking the fur throw with practiced precision. If you need anything in between, the kitchen will see to you. Work assignments come from Counselor Aldrich. That's the thin one with the gray vest who looks like he disapproves of everything. He doesn't. He's just built that way. She straightened up and looked at June with frank appraisal. Riva says you do supply records? Yes. Good. We're 3 weeks behind on the winter inventory audit, because the last man who did it left to get married and apparently forgot to finish anything before he went. She said this without particular bitterness, as a simple statement of administrative fact. Aldrich will be pleased. He won't show it, but he will be. She left, and June stood in the center of the room with her canvas bag still over her shoulder, listening to the sounds of the keep around her, the distant clang of metal from somewhere near the stables, voices in the courtyard below, the creak of the building settling in the cold, and tried to understand how she had arrived here. 3 days ago, she had walked out of Stonecrest with 12 copper coins and a cloak too light for the season. Now she was standing in a warm room in the King's Hall, and someone had lit her fire. She set her bag down and went to work. Counselor Aldrich was exactly as Dada had described, angular, gray-vested, with a face that arranged itself naturally into an expression of faint dissatisfaction that June recognized after 10 minutes of working with him had nothing to do with her or anyone in particular. It was simply his face. Underneath it, he was precise, organized, and genuinely relieved to have someone who understood columnar accounting. The inventory hall was a long room off the main keep's north corridor, lined with shelves of clay-sealed pots, wrapped parcels, sacks of grain and dried legumes, barrels of pickled vegetables, and hanging bundles of dried herbs and smoked meat. Everything was labeled in a system that had clearly been designed by someone with good intentions, and then maintained by 3 successive people who each had slightly different ideas about organization. June spent the first afternoon simply understanding what she was looking at. By the second day, she had begun restructuring the records. By the third, Aldrich had stopped hovering at the doorway and started bringing her problems directly. It was honest work, and she was grateful for it. It gave her somewhere to put her hands and her attention, which meant the thinking she was not ready to do yet could be safely postponed until evening, when she sat by her hearth with the fire burning low and the pine forest dark outside her window. Ozra's words came to her then, in the quiet. What they call barren, we sometimes call something else entirely. She had not yet processed the results of the examination at the healer's hall. Ozra had been careful, precise, and careful, the way a good healer is when the stakes are high, and certainty is genuinely unavailable. She had said, "I cannot make you a promise, but I can tell you that what I found is not what Stonecrest's healers described." She had used clinical language, spoken without drama, and June had listened and nodded, and then walked back to the inn and sat on the narrow bed and felt something crack open in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. Hope was a dangerous thing to carry when you had nothing to protect it with. She was still deciding what to do with it. She saw Leander on the 4th day. Not to speak to. She was crossing the courtyard with a supply ledger under her arm, and he was coming through the far gate with Riva and 2 other riders, all of them travel-dusted and moving with the particular efficiency of people who have been in the saddle for many hours and want very much to stop. He was wearing the same black riding cloak, or one very like it. The gray stallion was not with him. He was on foot, and somehow that made him both more and less imposing simultaneously. Less the symbol, more the person. He saw her at the same moment she recognized him. He did not break stride, but he held her gaze for a moment across the width of the courtyard. Not long, just long enough to register something, some acknowledgement that they were both here and both aware of it. Then he was past, walking with Riva toward the keep's main doors, their conversation resuming as if it had never paused. June stood in the courtyard with her ledger and the cold air on her face and thought, "He genuinely does not seem to find this remarkable." She found that more unsettling than grandeur would have been. The person who found it remarkable was a man named Court. She met him at the midday meal on her 5th day. Or rather, she had seen him at meals before. But on the 5th day, he chose the bench directly across from her at the long common table, and introduced himself with the particular energy of someone who has decided to have an opinion and is inviting you to disagree with it. He was perhaps 35, broad-shouldered, with reddish hair cut short, and a beard that suggested he'd stopped trimming it sometime in the last month, and had made peace with the outcome. He was one of Leander's senior writers, she gathered, not quite counsel, but present in rooms where counsel happened. "You're the Stonecrest woman," he said, not unkindly, pouring himself a cup of the dark grain broth that was the midday staple. "I'm June," she said. "Right." He tore a piece of bread. "I've been meaning to ask someone. What exactly did they tell you about why you're here?" She looked at him steadily. "Riva said the Alpha King wants my testimony regarding what happened at Stonecrest, that it was a violation of Northern law." Court chewed his bread and looked at the table for a moment. Something in his expression suggested he was making a decision about how much to say. "That's true," he said. "It is a violation. Leander's been building a case against Elder Brahm and his council for 3 years. He glanced up. "Stonecrest isn't the only pack that's been doing this. casting out omegas on false grounds, seizing their assets, removing their names from ancestral records. It's a systematic thing. Your case is one of perhaps 14 documented instances. He paused. You're not alone in this. June absorbed this slowly. Why are you telling me? She asked. Court set his bread down. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, not quite suspicion, not quite protectiveness. Something between the two, still deciding which direction to go. Because Leander doesn't explain himself, he said. He sees things and he acts on them and he assumes people will understand his reasoning eventually. Sometimes they do. Sometimes, he picked up his bread again. It would help if someone filled in the parts he leaves out. And you've appointed yourself for that. Someone has to. He drank his broth. He handed bread to a woman on a mountain road, and then sent Riva to find her and bring her here. That's either very straightforward or very complicated, and I haven't decided which. He looked at her directly. Have you? June thought about the way the Alpha King had held her gaze across the courtyard that morning. Steady, brief, entirely unreadable. No, she said honestly. Court nodded as if this was the correct answer. Good. Keep it that way for now. He stood, gathering his bowl. And June, lock your door at night. Not because of anyone in this keep. Just, it's a habit worth having. When you're new somewhere, and you don't know yet who knows you've arrived. He left before she could ask him what he meant. She sat at the long common table with her half-eaten meal, and the noise of the hall around her, and felt, for the first time since she'd arrived, that there was something underneath the surface of this place that she hadn't been shown yet, something that Court knew about and was deciding how much to tell her. Something that had to do with Stonecrest, and with her, and with why a king on a mountain road had handed bread to a stranger, and then made sure she knew which road was safe. She finished her meal. She went back to the inventory hall. She locked her door that night, and she started paying closer attention. The answer came from the ledgers. Not immediately, and not obviously. It came the way most important things come, sideways and quiet. Embedded in something that looked like routine work, until you were far enough into it to see the shape underneath. June had been reorganizing the winter inventory records for 8 days when she found the older files. They were stored in a cedar chest at the back of the inventory hall, beneath a folded canvas tarp that had collected a considerable quantity of dust. She had assumed they were historical surplus records, the kind of administrative accumulation that every large keep produces, and no one ever discards because discarding requires a decision, and decisions require effort. She opened the chest intending to catalog and close it, and found instead 7 years of correspondence between the King's Hall and the Northern Pack Councils. She should have brought them directly to Aldrich. She told herself this clearly, set the first bundle on the work table, and began to read. The early letters were administrative. Pack census reports, territorial boundary agreements, records of dispute arbitration. Dry and formal, the language of governance. But as she moved forward through the years, something began to change in the correspondence, a tension developing in the careful official phrasing, the way storm pressure develops before the weather actually breaks. 3 years ago, the letters from Elder Brom of Stonecrest had shifted in tone. She recognized the name like a cold hand closing around her throat and made herself keep reading. The letters documented a formal argument between Stonecrest and the King's Hall regarding what Brom called the rightful authority of pack councils to manage internal membership. The King's Hall responses, written in a hand she didn't recognize, clipped and precise, maintained that Northern law superseded pack council authority in matters of fundamental rights. The argument had been going on for 3 years, and then 6 months ago it had stopped. The last letter from Stonecrest was not from Elder Brom. It was from Councillor Mira, and it was brief and strange, its formal language barely containing something that read like alarm. It said that certain internal matters had been resolved, that the council wished to communicate its continued loyalty to the Northern Territories, and that they were confident the recent unpleasantness would not require further royal attention. June read it twice. The recent unpleasantness. She was, She understood with sudden cold clarity the recent unpleasantness. Or rather, she was not an isolated case, not an administrative error, not a healer's mistaken diagnosis. She was the most recent in a deliberate pattern, and Elder Brahm had stopped corresponding with the King's Hall 6 months ago because he had known, or suspected, that the correspondence was being compiled as evidence. She sat very still with the letter in her hands. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor. Familiar ones. Because she had been paying attention to the sounds of this keep for 8 days, and had learned which footsteps belonged to whom. These were not Aldrich's, not Dada's, not Court's particular heavy tread. Leander stopped in the doorway of the inventory hall. He looked at the open cedar chest, at the spread of documents on her work table, and at the letter still in her hands. His expression did not change dramatically, but something in it settled, like a door closing quietly rather than being shut. "You found the correspondence files," he said. "I found them," she agreed. She did not apologize or explain. She looked at him directly. He came into the room. Not quickly. Not with the energy of someone managing a situation, but with the measured pace of someone who had decided something and was carrying it through. He pulled the second stool from beside the shelving and sat down across the work table from her, which was not what she had expected. She had expected him to stand. Standing conveyed authority. Sitting across a work table from someone was something else entirely. "How much did you read?" he asked. "All of it," she said. "The last 7 years." A pause. "Then you understand what Stonecrest was doing." "I understand what the letters document," June said carefully. "I understand that Elder Brahm was arguing for the right to remove pack members on internally determined grounds, without appeal to Northern law. And I understand that this argument stopped 6 months ago, around the same time I was told I would be cast out." She set the letter down on the table between them. "What I don't understand is why the correspondence stopped. If you were building a case against him." "He found out," Leander said. "Someone in my council informed him that I was compiling documentation. He stopped writing and started acting, moving faster before I could establish legal grounds for formal intervention." He looked at the letter. "You were not the first woman Stonecrest cast out this way, but you were the first one I was able to reach before she disappeared into the valley towns." June looked at her own hands for a moment. "The others?" she said. "What happened to them?" "Some we found, some we didn't." His voice was even, but underneath the evenness was something that had weight. Old weight, the kind that comes from carrying something for a long time. "The ones we found are in valley settlements, mostly. They lost their ancestral records, their pack histories, everything that documented who they were. Brahm's counsel understood that if you take a person's name from the record, you make their testimony very difficult to use in a legal proceeding." He paused. "Your name is still on the Stonecrest record. They hadn't completed the removal when you left." June felt something move through her that she didn't have an immediate name for. "You knew that?" "Yes. That's why Riva came to find me." "Partly," he said. The word sat between them. She looked at him, at the winter bark eyes that were direct and gave away very little, and thought about what Court had said at the common table. He sees things and acts on them, and assumes people will understand his reasoning eventually. "What's the other part?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive. She had the sense that he was choosing words with real care, the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. "Ozra sent word," he said. "From the healer's hall at Ashford. She said her examination produced findings inconsistent with Stonecrest's diagnosis." He held her gaze. "I want to be careful here, because this is your health and your life, and I am not a healer. But if Ozra's findings are accurate, it adds a different dimension to the legal case. It means the council didn't just act on a policy disagreement. It means their healer either made a significant error or reported findings she knew were false." June was very still. "That's the difference," Leander continued, between a policy violation and deliberate fraud. Outside the inventory hall window, the wind had picked up, moving through the pine trees with a low, steady sound like breathing. The fire in the small wall hearth popped and resettled. June was aware of the stone floor under her boots, the cold smell of old cedar from the open chest, the rough texture of the letter under her fingertips. "You're asking me to testify not just to what happened," she said slowly. "You're asking me to be the center of it." "I'm asking you to consider it," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at the letter again. Counselor Mira's careful handwriting, the recent unpleasantness. 4 words that had translated her entire life into an administrative inconvenience. "And if I say no, then you stay here as long as you need to. Do the work Aldrich's grateful for, and I find another path to the same end." He said it without hesitation, without using it as leverage. It was simply a statement of fact. "My need to hold Brom accountable doesn't depend on your cooperation, but your testimony would be the strongest piece of the case. You have your name still on the record. You have Ozra's findings, and you were present for the formal reading of the decree, which means you can speak to what was said and how it was conducted." "Court told me to pay attention," she said. "To not decide yet who you are or what this is." Something that was not quite a smile moved through Leander's expression. "That sounds like Court. Is he right? About paying attention?" He stood, smoothing his riding coat. "Yes, always." He moved toward the door, then paused in the frame. "I'll have Aldrich bring you the formal case documentation if you want to read it. All of it, not just the Stonecrest files. You should know the full shape of what you'd be walking into before you make any decision." "I'd like that," June said. He nodded once and left. She sat alone in the inventory hall for a long time after, with the cedar chest open, and the letters spread across the table, and the wind moving through the pines outside, and tried to hold simultaneously in her mind the 2 things that were true at once. That Elder Brom had taken something from her deliberately, not carelessly, not out of ignorance, but with the specific intention of removing her before she could become inconvenient, and that the word Ozra had not quite said, had approached carefully, wrapped in professional qualification, was still sitting in June's chest like an ember, small and persistent, and stubbornly warm. Not what Stonecrest's healers described. She gathered the letters into a careful pile and began to organize them by date. If she was going to be the center of this, she was going to understand every part of it first. That evening, Court found her at the far end of the common hall, away from the fire, with the case documentation Aldrich had delivered and a cup of cooling grain broth she hadn't touched. He sat down beside her without being invited, which she had already understood was simply how Court operated in the world. "You talked to him," Court said. "Yes." "And?" She looked at the documents in front of her. At the careful, accumulated record of what had been done, to her and to others before her, and to others before them. At the architecture of a deliberate wrong, built patiently over years, and the equally patient construction of the case meant to answer it. "I'm reading," she said. Court looked at the pile of documents, then at her face. His expression shifted. The not quite suspicion, not quite protectiveness she'd noticed before, settling finally into something that was simply recognition. "Good," he said. He picked up her cup of cold broth, stood, and walked to the fire to reheat it. He came back and set it down without comment. She drank it, and kept reading. And outside the King's Hall, in the dark between the pine trees and the mountain road, a rider in a Stonecrest gray cloak sat his horse, and watched the lit windows of the keep, and turned his horse quietly back toward the mountain when the last light went out. June did not see him, but the dog sleeping near the gate raised its head and watched the tree line for a long time after the sound of hooves had faded. The first snow of real depth arrived on a Tuesday. June knew it was Tuesday because she had begun keeping a small tally on the inside cover of her working ledger. Not out of sentiment. but because the days had started to matter in a way they hadn't during her last months at Stonecrest, where time had moved like cold water, indifferent and continuous. Here, the days had texture. The morning Aldrich actually smiled at her inventory restructuring, which Dada later told her was a historic event. The afternoon Riva appeared in the inventory hall doorway and said, without preamble, "Come ride with me." And June had gone, because refusing Riva felt like arguing with weather. That ride had been its own kind of important. They had gone east along the plateau, where the pine forest opened into a long meadow that the frost had turned silver white and still. Riva rode without conversation for the first mile, which June had already learned to understand as a form of company rather than absence of it. When Riva did speak, she spoke directly. "You're trying to figure out if you can trust what's happening here," Riva said, her dark eyes on the tree line ahead. "Yes," June said. "That's sensible." Riva's horse moved steadily under her, breath clouding in the cold. "I'll tell you what I know, and you can weigh it yourself." She paused. "I've ridden with Leander for 11 years. I've watched him make decisions under conditions that would have broken most people I've known. He's not easy. He doesn't explain himself enough, and he carries things alone that he shouldn't. And sometimes his certainty about what needs to be done gets ahead of his attention to how it feels for the people involved." She glanced at June. "But I have never seen him use someone for a purpose that wasn't also genuinely in their interest. Not once." June watched the frozen meadow pass. "And you think bringing me here is in my interest?" "I think what Brahm's council did to you deserves an answer," Riva said. "And I think you deserve to be the one who gives it, if you choose to." She turned back to the tree line. "What I don't know is what you want. Not what you'll agree to. What you actually want." June thought about that for a long time. Long enough that the meadow gave way to forest again, and the cold deepened under the trees. "I want my name to mean something again," she said finally. It came out quieter than she intended, more exposed. I want the record to show what actually happened, not what Brahm's council wrote down." Riva nodded once, as if June had answered a question she'd been holding for a while. They rode back in the same companionable silence, and June felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, cautiously, as a decision beginning to form. The deep snow arrived 4 days after that ride, and with it came something June had not anticipated. Children. She heard them before she saw them. Voices in the courtyard below her window, high and chaotic. The particular joyful disorder of young people encountering new snow for the first time in a season. She looked out and saw 3 of them, ranging from perhaps 6 to 11 years old, engaged in the serious business of constructing something that might eventually become a snow fortification. They were failing enthusiastically. Dada appeared at June's door an hour later with a bundle of extra wool blankets and the information, delivered without particular ceremony, that the keep housed several families of pack members whose home settlements had become unsafe, mostly in the last 2 years, mostly in response to the same council pressures that June's case was part of. The children were part of those families. "They eat in the family hall, not the common hall," Dada said, folding a blanket with architectural precision. "But they run everywhere else. You'll get used to it." June had, in fact, already gotten used to it. The sound of the children in the courtyard had become a piece of the keep's texture, like the morning bell, and the smell of wood smoke, and the particular creak of the 3rd step on the north staircase. She found she didn't mind it. It reminded her that the keep was a living thing, not an institution. One morning, returning from the inventory hall with a stack of completed ledgers, she found a child sitting on the floor of the corridor outside her door. A girl, perhaps 8, with 2 dark braids and an expression of concentrated misery that suggested some social catastrophe had recently occurred. June stopped. "Are you all right?" "My brother took my stick," the girl said, with the gravity of someone reporting a serious injustice to an appropriate authority. "Your stick," June repeated. "I found it. It was mine. He said it was just a stick and sticks don't belong to people. The girl's expression suggested this argument was philosophically unacceptable. June considered this. Where did you find it? By the east gate. Then it was yours, June said. Things found have the right of the finder. That's older than pack law. The girl looked at her with sudden focused attention, as if June had said something that reorganized the situation entirely. Is that a real rule? It is, June said. She had no idea if this was technically accurate. It felt true, which seemed sufficient for the moment. What's your name? Petra, the girl said. June felt something move through her at the name, the echo of another Petra, who had braided her hair for the Harvest Festival many years ago, in a world that no longer quite existed. It passed quickly. Well, Petra, she said, I think you should find your stick and hide it somewhere your brother won't think to look. That's also an old rule. The girl considered this strategy, found it sound, and departed down the corridor with renewed purpose. June watched her go, and felt the small, unexpected warmth of it, the simplicity of a solvable problem. She was in the inventory hall that afternoon when Court arrived with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. He closed the door behind him, which was unusual. Court was not a person who closed doors. There's something you need to know, he said. He sat across the work table from her and told her what one of the gate guards had reported that morning. A rider had been seen in the tree line east of the keep 3 nights running, watching the lit windows from the darkness. The rider wore a gray cloak, Stonecrest gray. June absorbed this in silence. Brom knows you're here, Court said. He said it plainly, without wrapping it in reassurance that would have been hollow. We don't know how. Likely the same person in the council who informed him about the legal documentation 3 years ago. He has someone here, or near here, who passes information. What does it mean? June asked. For the case. It means he knows the timeline has accelerated. And it means... Court stopped. Ran his hand over his short beard, in a gesture she recognized as him deciding how much to say. Brom has allies in 3 other pack councils. If he moves formally against Leander's legal proceedings before we can file with the Northern Tribunal, he can delay the case by years. He needs to discredit the testimony before it's entered into the record. Discredit me, June said. Yes. She looked at the work table, at her careful ledgers and her organized files and the quiet, honest work of 8 days. At the cedar chest in the corner with its 7 years of correspondence. At her own hands, bandaged no longer, the blister healed. How would he do that? She asked. Court's expression was careful. The Stonecrest record still shows your name, but Brom could petition the tribunal directly to have it formally struck before your testimony is accepted. The legal argument would be that a former pack member with no current affiliation has diminished standing. He paused. It's a procedural argument, not a factual one, but it could work. Unless I have current affiliation, June said. The words came out of her slowly, as if she was discovering them as she spoke. Court looked at her steadily. He didn't answer immediately, which told her she had understood something he had been working toward saying. Riva told you what you wanted, she said. You've both been trying to show me the shape of this without pushing me into it. Yes, Court said. And Leander? Leander told me to tell you the facts and let you reach your own conclusions. A pause. He was very specific about that. June stood and walked to the window. The courtyard below was empty in the thin afternoon light, the snow undisturbed except for a line of small footprints. Petra's, she suspected, or one of the other children, crossing from the family wing to the east gate. The pine tree line beyond the wall was dark and still. She thought about a rider in Stonecrest gray, watching lit windows from the darkness. She thought about Counselor Mira's letter, the recent unpleasantness. She thought about 4 words that had been used to replace a person. She thought about Ozra's careful, qualified words, and the ember still sitting in her chest, persistent and small, that she had been protecting with both hands without admitting she was doing it. If I file for formal sanctuary under Northern law, she said, not turning from the window. That gives me current affiliation. King's Hall Sanctuary is a recognized status before the tribunal. Yes, court said, and it would need to be filed before Brahm's petition reaches the tribunal. We have perhaps 5 days, court said, likely less. June turned from the window. She looked at Court's face. The reddish beard, the steady eyes, the expression that had started as not quite suspicion and had traveled a long distance from there in 12 days. I need to speak to Leander, she said. Court stood immediately. He's in the East Council room. I'll take you. They walked together down the corridor, past the third step that creaked, past the family hall where she could hear voices, a woman, and the higher register of children, past the south window where the afternoon light was turning the snow outside briefly gold. She thought, 12 days ago, I was walking down a mountain with 12 copper coins, and nowhere to be. She thought, something is about to change, and I am the one changing it. She thought very quietly, and only to herself, I am not what Brahm's council wrote down. I never was. The East Council room door was ajar. Through it, she could see Leander standing at the long table, reviewing a document. His riding coat hung on the chair behind him, his dark head bent over the page. He looked in that unguarded moment like a person doing difficult work with full attention. Not a symbol, not a title, not the figure on the gray stallion from a mountain road. Just a man, carrying something heavy, trying to carry it right. Court pushed the door open. Leander looked up, and his eyes moved from Court to June, and in the half-second before he arranged his expression into its usual careful steadiness, she saw something in it. Relief, perhaps, or the anticipation of relief. The way a face looks when something it has been waiting for arrives. June, he said. I want to file, she said, for formal sanctuary, and I want to give testimony. She held his gaze. But I want to read everything first. Every document, every precedent, every piece of the case. I'm not walking into that tribunal blind. A pause. Then, that's reasonable. I also want Ozra brought here from Ashford. Her findings need to be part of the formal record. I'll send a writer today. And I want Court in the room when the tribunal hearing happens. She glanced at Court. He fills in the parts that get left out. Court made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Leander looked at her for a long moment. At the woman who had walked down a mountain with nothing, and had spent 12 days reading and working and paying attention, and had arrived in this doorway knowing exactly what she was asking for and why. All right, he said. All of it. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and the last of the afternoon gold faded from the snow. And somewhere in the courtyard, the sound of children's voices rose and fell like something that had always lived there. June thought, this is not the end of something. Then she corrected herself. It is the end of something. Just not the end she had expected when she walked out of Stonecrest 3 weeks ago, in a cloak too light for the season. The Northern Tribunal convened on the last day of November. It was held in the Great Hall of the King's Hall, which had been rearranged for the occasion. The long common tables pushed back, 3 tribunal judges seated at the elm table, where Aldrich usually reviewed supply requests, their gray robes formal and deliberate against the stone walls. Witnesses sat to the left. The accused representatives of Stonecrest Council sat to the right, rigid and careful, Elder Brahm among them with his white beard and his carved stone expression, which June found, now that she was looking at it from across a formal proceeding rather than from the position of someone being cast out, considerably less powerful than it had once seemed. She sat straight and spoke clearly. She had read everything, as she'd said she would. Every document, every precedent, every piece of the case that Leander's counsel had compiled over 3 years. She understood the shape of what had been done, and she understood her place within it. And when the senior tribunal judge asked her to describe the events of the formal decree reading at Stonecrest, she described them precisely, without drama, in the plain language of someone reporting facts she had memorized because they mattered. Ozra testified after her. The healer had arrived from Ashford 4 days prior, quietly, with a saddlebag full of notes and the same direct, unhurried manner she'd shown in her examination hall. Her findings were entered into the formal record without dispute. The tribunal's own appointed healer confirmed them within a day of review. The deliberation took 2 hours. The verdict took 4 sentences. Elder Brahm and 3 members of the Stonecrest Council were removed from their positions and remanded to tribunal oversight. The PAC's internal authority was suspended pending restructuring under Northern law. All formal removals conducted under Brahm's counsel in the last 6 years were declared procedurally invalid and entered for review. And June's name, her full name, daughter of Wren, of Stonecrest PAC, was formally restored to the ancestral record, with a notation of wrongful removal appended in permanent ink. She heard the senior judge read those words, and felt something leave her body that she hadn't known she was still carrying. It went quietly, the way it had arrived, without drama, without a sound. Just a weight that had been there so long she had stopped noticing it, and then wasn't there anymore. Court, seated to her left, said nothing. He put his hand briefly on the table near hers, not touching, just near, and then took it away. That was enough. In the weeks that followed, the King's Hall returned to itself. The tribunal judges departed. The formal documentation was copied, sealed, and sent to the Northern Archive. Aldrich resumed his expression of faint ambient dissatisfaction, which was deeply reassuring in its familiarity. The children in the courtyard built a snow structure that had evolved far beyond its original fortification ambitions into something that Petra described, with complete seriousness, as a palace. June finished the winter inventory audit. It was thorough and well organized, and Aldrich told her so in a sentence so compressed it contained almost no adjectives, which she had learned to recognize as high praise. She stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, though that had been true once, but because she had looked at the shape of her days and found that they had become, without her fully noticing the moment it happened, a life rather than a waiting room. The inventory work was honest and useful. Riva had taken her riding 3 more times. Dada had begun leaving an extra portion at her place at the common table without comment, as if it were simply always how things had been. And Ozra's findings, confirmed now by the tribunal's own record, sat in June's chest no longer as an ember, but as something steadier. A fact she was still learning to hold without flinching. Still learning to let be true without immediately protecting herself from it. She and Leander did not speak of it directly. Some things move slowly, and should. What they had instead were conversations in the inventory hall when he came to review administrative documentation. Evenings at the far end of the common table, where the firelight was good and the noise of the hall gave a kind of privacy. Mornings where he paused in the courtyard, and they stood for a moment watching the pine tree line in the early light before the day's demands arrived. Small things. Honest ones. He had kept every promise he'd made in the East Council room. Nothing more, nothing less. She had begun to understand that this was, for him, the fundamental language of trust. Not declarations, but the quiet, repeated fact of doing what you said you would do. She understood that language. She had been learning it her whole life. On the first morning of December, June sat at her window before the keep had fully woken, watching snow fall soft and straight in the windless air. The pine trees held it on their branches in long white lines. The courtyard below was smooth and unbroken. She thought about the mountain road, the cold, the 12 copper coins, the bread that had tasted of walnut and dried apple, handed down from the back of a gray horse by a man she hadn't known, who had also told her which road was safer. She thought about how the right fork had led here. She opened her ledger to the inside cover, where she kept her day tally, and looked at the count. 41 days since she had walked out of Stonecrest. She added the 42nd mark, closed the ledger, and went downstairs to breakfast. The dog was asleep by the gate. The fire in the common hall was already burning. Dada had left an extra portion at her place. June sat down and ate, and was warm.